Hello and welcome to Tattvadeep, Conversations and Explorations. Our series of conversations on biology is now over. However, before moving on to our next subject, which will be sociology, we'd like to share with you a compilation of insights shared by our guests on what they think biology to be. Biology, it seems, is the pursuit of the query, as Professor Gunther Wagner puts it, of how life as a material process is able to come up with qualitatively new forms of life. These qualitatively new forms then develop an internal equilibrium that can be maintained in the absence of the external equilibrium, as Professor Ramaswamy Subramaniam puts it. Once the internal equilibrium is achieved, then it interacts with the external environment and develops a relationship, which for Dr. Raymond Tallis is quite different in the case of human beings than for other species, such that he is of the opinion and understanding that we as human beings are a part of nature to some extent, but in another sense, distanced from nature, he says. This relationship, whether in our case or in the case of all other species, it seems to us on Tattvadeep, what Professor Ashley Griffin calls the causal factor of changes, which then leads to the unfoldment of fitness, diversity, and relatedness, as Professor Arvind Ogran and Professor Amitabh Joshi share respectively. All these phenomena are, of course, being studied by the biologist, and in that case, biology is that which biologists do, which is one of Professor John Wilkins's thoughts on what biology might actually be. From these 9 conversations, it seems to us that creativity, equilibrium, interaction, change, adaptability, diversity, and relatedness are the essential concepts that biology is attempting to understand about the living world through its study of living things. That these phenomena are a few billion years old, and in that sense could be a part of what can be loosely phrased as the DNA of life, seemed to us beautiful, incredible, reassuring, worthwhile, all at the same time. And as always, it would be wonderful to know if these conversations made any impact on your worldview as well. Once again, we'd like to thank our guests for being generous with their time and insights on Tattvadeep. And with that, let's get straight to what biology is, as per our guest experts. Enjoy.
Well, biology, quite simply, is the study of life, the study of living things. Like all sciences, it has changed over time. Whatever science you choose, chemistry or astronomy, the further back you go in time, the more different it is from today. So what they studied in past centuries, we might still recognize as biology, but it's not the same as practiced today. Today, it's become, of course, a very sophisticated natural science.
So biology is a very general term used to define anything that is living or is capable of replicating, right? So the way you could define a system that is biological and non-biological is actually a very simple way to think about it. The way I think about it is, if you leave a dead fruit, it will rot. What does that mean? It reaches an equilibrium with its environment if you don't do anything. What is life? It is able to separate itself from the environment. It might use energy, it might use other things, but maintains an equilibrium that is inside and that is different from the outside. Any system that can make the energy and do it themselves, to do that in some ways is what one would call life. Often people think that the ability to self-replicate without help of anything else is life. But that's a very poor definition, while it might be true, because if you think of a virus, we can argue whether it's living or non-living. It cannot replicate itself, but we still call it as part of biology. So I'm just differentiating what definition people think for life is from what biology is. So biology is the study of organisms, it's the study of things where there is an internal equilibrium that can be maintained in the absence of the external equilibrium, right? And can make the difference. That's what I would call biology. The most important thing to remember is biology still has to follow all the laws of physics, chemistry, that exists. So it cannot do things that are beyond what physics and chemistry can do.
I agree with your previous interviewees that one of fundamental aspect is that organisms and they are alive because they resist decay and are able to harvest energy from the environment to maintain their own structure and activities. It is also the case that, as you inferred, that even the process of dying is not a random process, but one that is highly structured and conditional upon the way life is sustaining itself. And you can see that from the simple fact that there is a science of pathology that basically tells you how, in what ways, and along what pathways organisms disintegrate or lose their functionality, right? I mean, we have names for diseases which we can only do if what's happening to organisms as they lose the ability to continue living, do it in a structured way. Otherwise, giving names to a random process wouldn't make any sense, right? So that I'm an evolutionary biologist. So from my perspective, I would add another dimension to what life is and how biology tries to understand it. And that is the fact that unlike most non-living systems, although there are exceptions and we can talk about those, what's fascinating about life, and this is the reason I got into this field, is that it is an open-ended process. And is one where new forms of existence arise continuously, even though slowly, so that we don't see it that easily. We see it quickly with germs that try to kill us, but that same process that creates new forms of germs that attack our body. There are also new forms of higher organisms arising all the time, although at a more slower time scale, but still, and that was really what drove me to become a biologist, and me trying to understand how life as a material process is able to create whatever that means, to come up with qualitatively new forms of life, right? I mean, there's no reason a priori to expect that it would be a better idea to have multicellular organisms like humans and animals and plants and so on, because bacteria do perfectly well in their basic business of creating a difference and a boundary between themselves and the environment and making more copies of themselves, right? They do that perfectly. They do it much better than we do, because it takes us 9 months to get a new baby. They do it in 20 minutes, right? So the really fascinating thing is how complexity comes into the world, how more complex forms of life could originate. And so that's really what drives my intellectual life.
It's a study of living creatures, essentially, coming from the Greek bios, which is life, and logos, which refers to generally studies. I think I focused very much on how we as human beings are and are not defined biology, how we are, yes, part of nature to some extent, but in another sense, distance from nature. And most of my books have been really devoted to specifying that distance, the difference we are from all other living creatures, at the same time trying to give some kind of explanation of how that distance arose, how we are different, profoundly different, even from our nearest primate kin, like chimpanzees and gorillas and so on.
Well, there's a straightforward but largely uninformative answer to that. Biology is the study of living things. That doesn't help you much, because you need to know what counts as a living thing and it doesn't tell you about the structure of biology, of the biological sciences. A slightly more informative but still largely empty definition is that biology is what biologists do. Along the lines of science is what scientists do. But of course now the problem is to what extent do we allow, for example, a chiropractor to be a biologist, or somebody who disagrees with germ theory, and I do know a few people who disagree with germ theory. So what I'm going to say instead is that biology is largely an administrative unit. And I'll have to tell you a little bit about the history of it to tell you why that is. When the sciences were classified in the 19th century, largely beginning with William Whewell in his 1840s publications, biology had only just been named. Prior to that, there was natural history, which is an older term for what we might think of as sciences related to the earth and the things on the earth, as opposed to natural philosophy, which was the things related to the heavens and the things that were in the heavens. So astronomy and physics and so forth. Alchemy was swapped between the two, really. It was more natural philosophy. So when the term biology was widely applied around about 1800, what happened was that the universities started to set up positions for people to study this new field. There were still departments of zoology and of botany and geology and all those different sorts of fields. Towards the end of the 19th century, especially in Britain, but in European countries generally, universities started to be funded by the state, and there was an increase in the number of people teaching these subjects, and so we needed fields and departments. And if you've got a department, then of course you need to have a department head, you need to have criteria for who gets included and so forth. And so biology was regarded at that point as a science rather than a group of fairly disparate disciplines like comparative anatomy, paleontology, the newly named ecology, which had only just started by that stage. So biology is any or all of those things. It is indeed the study of life, but we still don't have a proper, universally agreed notion of life. We've got biochemistry, organic chemistry, these biological. We've got now the idea of xenobiology, which is potential biological things off the planet Earth. NASA has a program of xenobiology in which they go looking for things that are very much like life on our planet. And of course, it may be that life is something quite distinct on another planet or even out in space. So it's a hard question to answer.
So biology is the study of life, and I think biology occupies a rather unique, but what I think is the most fascinating part of science. So biology is concerned with living things, entities that are alive. And of course, we know that these living things are made of the same particles like anything else. They obey the same laws of physics like anything else. But also, anyone who's looked at a plant or at an animal know that these things are quite different than a rock or compared to a wave or something. And it's in that kind of uniqueness, that's kind of what biologists are interested in. And in particular, as evolutionary biologists, which is the branch of biology that I've come from, we were interested in kind of why organisms are the way they are, and kind of why they are so different, and often why they are so well suited for the environment in which they live. And you can go about study this in many ways. People study this in the lab, people go out into nature to observe them or to set up experiments. I've often come to it from a more theoretical point of view. I've often been interested in the kind of the nature of the explanations that we come up with, and to develop kind of general models of evolution. And in particular, I've been interested in kind of puzzles of evolution, things that kind of initially don't really make sense from the kind of traditional theories of evolution by natural selection. And so I've been interested in problems often related to social evolution, why organisms cooperate with each other, and indeed why the parts of the body cooperate with each other so well that they do.
Biology is the science of the living world, right? So bio is like Latin for life, and so like the biology is like the study of a living thing. So it's as opposed to studying physics or chemistry, where you're studying like atoms and molecules or forces, natural forces, whether it's in space or within atoms. It's the realm of physicists. The 21st century has been said by lots of people to be the age of biology, because a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now with resistance to antibiotics and bacterial infections, COVID pandemic, for obvious example, global warming, all of these sort of major challenges that we're facing right now have to be solved by biology. So it's a really exciting time to be a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist, as you've just said, and so my particular area of expertise isn't so much like in a certain organism. So some biologists will specialize in crop plants, or they might specialize in like primate behavior, monkey behavior, or whatever it is. My expertise is in evolutionary biology, which is really in the processes that underline how species change over time, how understanding how organisms are adapted to their environment in the way that Darwin first explained 150 years ago. So it's the process of change is the thing that I'm most interested in. My research covers lots of different kinds of organisms, from bacteria to birds to worms, lots of different organisms. But that's because I'm an evolutionary biologist and everything evolves.
Briefly, biology is a study of the living world, the part of the world that consists of all the different life forms that we call species, or different types of animals, plants, microbes, fungi. So biology as a science would be that which tries to understand the irregularities we see in this living world and build up some explanation for why it is the way it is. For example, unusual things as compared to non-living things of physical objects. They have all kinds of properties, including those of growth, of reproduction, of responding in very clear ways to changes in the environment and so on. So these properties that biology is to try to understand what makes a living thing alive. Other part of biology, which is sometimes relatively neglected, for example, we immediately notice that there's a great diversity of species. The world is not just covered with one kind of bacterium or one kind of plant or something like that. There's this huge diversity, so that needs explanation. Also, the diversity is not random in that we can lump together different species based on different degrees of similarity in how they appear or how they behave or how they are made up, what they are made up of, and so on. So we would all feel comfortable recognizing that a dog and a cat are more similar to each other than is to a frog. And all three of them are more similar to each other than either of them is to a T. So we also find this pattern of relatedness among species, and that needs explanation. And finally, we find that most species save independently, so they seem to be to their environments, and that is also a feature of the living world that needs explanation. To understand the diversity, the relatedness, and the adaptedness of species, this is what falls in the domain of what one might call ecology, evolutionary biology, organismal biology, animal behavior. The first set of questions about what makes a living thing alive is more in the realm of sort of cellular molecular biology, the underlying mechanisms at that reductionist level.